Yeah, yeah. We'll return later to the image of the tank man when we talk a little bit more in depth about what exactly happened on June 4th, 1989. But you are right that it has basically become a metonym for the event itself. And, it's the singular image that people bring up in their minds when anyone so much as utters Tiananmen. And you talked a little bit about this earlier, but there are like tons of photos that were taken during the protests, many of which contradict the popular narratives that we've grown accustomed to. Images of soldiers and students and other protesters sitting together in the square because, as you said earlier, there was some sympathy from the soldiers to the demands of the protesters. And then, also these really graphic images later on during the protests of protesters torching tanks, PLA tanks, lynching PLA soldiers, violently attacking PLA soldiers. But those kinds of images, are never brought up in people's minds when they think of the protests. But we can't understand the protests without first understanding the political context that led up to them. So I know you discussed a bit earlier about the Cultural Revolution, but maybe we could step back a few years and, could you talk a little bit about some of the economic and ideological conditions that led up to the protests? And, what role did Deng Xiaoping's opening up reforms play in creating these conditions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the best sources on the lead up to the 1989 movement and sort of the social composition of the protest movement itself. That actually comes from like a Chinese perspective is the essay by Wang Hui entitled "The Year 1989 and the Historical Roots of Neoliberalism in China," which is part of his collection, "The End of the Revolution," which was actually published by Verso. Interestingly, because I think at the time they were a lot more comfortable with his background as an active participant in the 1989 movement. Who was for a time persecuted for it, but who went on to become like the leading Chinese New Left intellectual. And from the time that he was writing was rather more critical, I would say, of the direction that the Chinese government was taking than he is now, for the understandable reason that there is this materially and ideologically quite significant revival of red culture, as it's called, and a sort of deepening and revivification, I guess, of the socialist project there, right? So I think that Wang Hui's reputation as an intellectual is a little bit on the outs when it comes to the Western left, but his analysis of 1989 is still very solid. To sort of sum it up, in the period from 1978 to 84, the primary focus of the reform process was on rural areas, which, at the time, certainly constituted a large majority of the Chinese population, and a significant basis still of the overall national economy. Basically, what these reforms did was they, decollectivized the people's communes. They instituted, a household responsibility system for land management and cultivation, and perhaps most relevantly to this discussion, they were also aimed at raising prices for agricultural products, and thereby raising incomes for farmers. And during that period, they did in fact make significant headway in beginning to close, though not at all entirely closing the income gap between rural and urban areas. And then starting in 1984, as what was sort of always intended from the beginning as a complement to the rural reforms, urban reforms started in earnest. And these were focused in a couple of areas, most relevantly, sort of decentralizing state industrial management and breaking up monopolies. So these had the effect of essentially creating a small but certainly non-negligible stratum of people within the party apparatus who had sort of high-level management positions at these enterprises, and now had a lot sort of more freedom to not deviate entirely from state planning, but to experiment with how to implement it, right? And just sort of exercising effective control over large chunks of the urban economy in individual cities. And another piece of these urban reforms was to substantially lift price controls and to institute a so-called two-track price system, where commodities would essentially have one price assigned to them, for state procurement, and then another that was sort of based more on market forces. And the fact that these two tracks apply to many of the same consumer products in particular, they led in ways that I believe Isabella Weber explores, in a lot more depth in her book, How China Avoided Shock Therapy. They were a spur to the overall volume of production, certainly, and to economic growth. But also, understandably, when you have a two-track price system and the market-based prices are significantly and systematically higher than the state procurement practices, that creates an enormous incentive for hoarding, basically, of commodities that were originally intended to be produced for state procurement, but end up being sold for significantly higher amounts on the private market. And this, of course, the combination of these reforms certainly had a lot of contradictory effects, including exacerbating inequality, creating this sort of managerial stratum that also found its kind of ideological counterpart in the Chinese intelligentsia, and of course rampant corruption with the two-track price system, and just inflation of prices for staple foods. This was that part was in many ways a direct result of the rural reforms earlier, right? But also a whole swath of other, just a basket of goods that determines kind of cost of living in urban areas. And it also led to the first kind of the first blows against the so-called iron rice bowl system of very robust welfare provisions for the urban proletariat. So all these together, of course, generated in parallel with tremendous economic growth overall, enormous economic dislocations as well, and that sort of set the scene in material or economic terms for where we're at in 1989. In ideological terms, what's happening sort of in parallel to all of this, following from the Sino-Soviet split and the rapprochement with the U.S. and the sort of, controlled but substantial opening to foreign direct investment from the West, right, was also a major heightening of, Western and particularly U.S. ideological influence, a sort of turning, especially on the part of the intelligentsia, as I mentioned earlier, from other socialist states to the United States as kind of like a developmental model to aspire to, and at a cultural level, the sort of deep penetration of Western liberal ideas into the sort of overall understanding these intellectuals, not just in terms of how they oriented themselves to the international picture and to, for example, bilateral ties between China and the U.S., but also their attitudes towards the rest of what was then still known as the Third World, um, and to their historical evaluations of recent Chinese history itself, right? So this entailed on the part of intellectuals and of many students in particular, kind of a rejection of a lot of the basic precepts of the Maoist developmental period, in sort of the most extreme cases, an overt rejection of Marxism and indeed embrace of just straight up neoliberal thinkers like Hayek and Friedman, which in many ways at least partially captured a lot of um, the sort of economic management, and sort of business sector of Chinese universities. And it also had the effect of sundering, as I mentioned, these affective and political and ideological ties with third world peoples in general, right? And one sort of very notable, though poorly remembered, example of this was just the year before, in 1988, in Nanjing. There's basically a large I guess there's a large student mobilization specifically aimed at international students from Africa who were studying at the university there, at Hehai University. And this was very much imbued with overt anti-blackness. One of the sort of leading slogans of the period was quite literally "Down with Black Devils."
Yeah.
It was spurred by sort of highly racialized and kind of misogynistic narratives surrounding these African students' alleged propensity for crime or tendency to form relationships with female Chinese students. Really ugly stuff. But ultimately, the reason why the expression of this became so sort of overt in this particular instance was because the overall ideological project of reorienting towards the U.S. as developmental also meant incorporating a lot of racist attitudes, right? And de facto, sort of white supremacist ones into this kind of Chinese context, corresponding also with an evacuation and a real lessening, even from official state sources of declarations of solidarity with Black liberation struggles, whether in the First World or for the decolonization of the Third World, right, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where many of these students came from. And so that was one particular stark expression of this that sort of needs to be mentioned, as a in one way as a corrective to the sort of unidimensional portrayal of the more reactionary segment of the student leaders, including later at Tiananmen, as like very sort of liberal-minded, Western-oriented, freedom-loving idealist youths, right? But also, I think shows how that level of Western ideological influence and penetration, it really all comes as a package, and yeah, I think that connection, is worth drawing, even if we, we shouldn't necessarily draw a direct line from what happened in Nanjing in 1988 to Beijing in 89, but it provides useful context, I think, for the contradictions of the ideological churning that was taking place at the same time, and this all sort of leads together into the immediate conjuncture of 1989 itself and the start of that protest movement, which it began initially actually as an outpouring of public grief and mourning and sort of politically directed criticism of a number of different developments, right? But in the wake of the death of former General Secretary of the Communist Party, Hu Yaobang, who was identified very much as belonging to the reform wing of the Communist Party, both in economic and political terms, and that meant that from the jump, we can get into more detail, I guess, in the subsequent question, but really it brought together a confluence of ideological influences that were heavily colored by Western liberalism, with a sort of very contradictory attitude towards economic reform, where on the one hand, a lot of the initial wave of protesters, were arguing for a deepening of the reforms, right, particularly under this Western ideological influence, while simultaneously, expressing like righteous and, to be honest, quite justified outrage at a lot of the effects and the epiphenomena of those reforms, in particular the corruption, especially within the party apparatus, the inflation, cost of living, and so on, and that sort of in a very extended presentation is how all of these material and ideological unmoorings, I suppose, from the track of Chinese development during the Mao era, and in the early, really the first decade of the reform era, led to where we were in 1989.
Yeah. Someone who does a really good job of illustrating this shift after the reforms is someone on the chat reading list, Li Minqi. And in his preface to The Rise of China and the Demise of the Capitalist World Economy, he describes this really well. He says, quote, "The 1980s was a decade of political and intellectual excitement in China. Despite some half-hearted official restrictions, large sections of the Chinese intelligentsia were politically active and were able to push for successive waves of the so-called emancipation of ideas. The intellectual critique of the already existing Chinese socialism at first took place within a Marxist discourse. Dissident intellectuals called for more democracy without questioning the legitimacy of the Chinese Revolution or the economic institutions of socialism." But then he goes on. After 1985, however, economic reform moved increasingly in the direction of the free market. Corruption increased, and many among the bureaucratic elites became the earliest big capitalists. Meanwhile, among the intellectuals, there was a sharp turn to the right. The earlier Maoist phase of Chinese socialism was increasingly seen as a period of political oppression and economic failure. Chinese socialism was supposed to have failed as it had lost the economic growth rates to places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Many regarded Mao Zedong himself as an ignorant, backward Chinese peasant who turned into a cruel, power-hungry despot who had been responsible for the killing of tens of millions. The politically active intellectuals no longer borrowed discourse from Marxism. Instead, Western classical liberalism and neoliberal economics, as represented by Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, had become the new fashionable ideology. So I forgot to mention, but this guy, Li Minqi, I believe he was one of the student protesters during that time, and he was arrested, spent a couple of years in jail, and then later in his life became a Marxist and like one of the more famous advocates for the Chinese New Left. And after he became a Marxist, he started to reflect on his participation in the protests in that period. Reflect on it from like more of a Marxist perspective. But yeah, that was always the risk that these economic reforms brought. They opened up the country to foreign investment and foreign technology in order to overcome the decades of poverty and underdevelopment in exchange for cheap labor and super profits. But in addition to this technology transfer and economic development, a capitalist class had also developed. And with that, a large segment of society that looked to the US as a political model or favored these US financial institutions or, became influenced by these ideas of anti-Blackness or white supremacy, as was the case in the anti-African student riots you mentioned earlier.